Hello and welcome to the Majlis podcast, Radio Free Europe, Radio Liberty's current affairs talk show focusing on Central Asia. I'm Bruce Pannier, host of the Majlis and author of the Central Asian Focus newsletter. Tajik opposition activist Dilmurod Ergashev fled Tajikistan and had been seeking asylum in Germany since 2011. On October 28th, the German court ordered Ergashev to be deported back to Tajikistan, where he faces torture and imprisonment. He arrived in Tajikistan on November 7th and was immediately placed in custody. Koshkarbay Dilmurod is an activist from Karakol, Pakistan, an area in what is now Uzbekistan. Dilmurod is one of the many Karakalpaks who would like the region to have more autonomy from Uzbekistan, something that is guaranteed in Uzbekistan's constitution. Uzbek authorities are against this, and Dilmurod was forced to flee to neighboring Kazakhstan, where he was detained in 2022 and eventually released, but needed to leave Kazakhstan and travel further, winding up in Poland, where he is seeking asylum at the moment. These are only two of many Central Asians who hoped Europe would be a safe sanctuary, but increasingly, European governments are deporting them, despite knowing the likely fate that awaits them in their former homelands. On this program, we look at the problems Central Asian opposition figures and Central Asian citizens face as they try to stay in Europe. To discuss all this, I'm joined by Leila Seiitbek, a lawyer and chairwoman of the NGO Freedom for Eurasia, and Hugh Williamson, the Europe and Central Asia Director of Human Rights Watch. Thank you both for being on the program. Hugh, I'm going to start with you. Could you describe the case of Dilmurod Ergashev for us, please?
Thanks so much for having me on the program again, Bruce. I appreciate it. Yeah, this is an important topic you've picked this week, and his case, Dilmurod Ergashev's case, is symbolic in a sense, as you say, of a trend that's happening in Europe at the moment. He's a 40-year-old Tajik man, been living in the western part of Germany since 2011, tried to apply for asylum a number of times and was rejected. A complicated case in terms of his identity and so on. But the key aspects are that he was active in the Tajik opposition scene in Germany, particularly over the last few years. He was active, associated himself with Group 24, which is an opposition movement now banned, of course, in Tajikistan for many years, but has some following outside Tajikistan, including in Europe. And he was active with a group of opposition, activists, dissidents in Germany. He took part in protests in Germany. For instance, he took part in a protest almost exactly a year ago in October 23, when President Rahmon came to Berlin to meet Chancellor Scholz. And there were protests around that visit outside the embassy and so on. And he was quite clearly part of those protests. I mean, there was footage showing that, and he was part of other protests as well, was active on social media. So had a certain profile here. Nevertheless, the procedures for whether he could stay in Germany sort of rolled on. And as you said, just in the last few days of October, the procedures of him not having asylum status in Germany came to a head, and courts ruled that he should be deported back to Tajikistan, despite interventions from his lawyer, his very active lawyer, who made the case that he's a political activist and known to the Tajik authorities, and that the consequences of him being returned would be that he would be jailed, he would be probably mishandled or tortured in detention. Despite those interventions, he was indeed deported on November the 6th and arrived in Tajikistan early on November the 7th, where, as you said, he was immediately detained by security forces in Tajikistan. And taken off to an unknown location. I suspect the same thing will happen as it happened in the previous other cases of people who've been deported from Germany. They are detained in security services prisons. In a few weeks or a couple of months, they'll be given a sort of show trial whereby they'll be charged with spurious terrorism-related charges, and then given long prison sentences. Perhaps later in the program, we'll talk about other cases of people who've been deported from Germany. There's two other cases in the last 18 months where there's a certain pattern. Another key thing about his case is that the court questioned whether he really was an opposition activist, despite the evidence I've outlined that he was involved with protests and things, making the suggestion that he was really taking part in opposition activities in order to reinforce his case for asylum in Germany. Of course, it's difficult to look in people's minds and see their motivations for these things. I would say there's clear evidence that he knew the risks of being involved in protests, such as very high-profile ones when you're confronting the president of the country. But in any case, the key point really is not whether what Germany makes of his opposition activity is really the realization which the German courts should have made that Tajikistan would have seen him and does see him as an opposition figure, an opposition activist, and therefore were very pleased when he was put on the plane, I'm sure, back to Tajikistan, and that's why he was detained immediately. So that sort of awareness is missing in Germany of that connection to what the perspective is of the country that people are being returned to. And of course, final point, he should never have been returned in the first place because there are international rules on these issues called non-refoulement, which means that people should not, whatever the circumstances, whatever their backgrounds, whether they have a valid asylum claim or not, they should not be returned to countries where there's a strong chance they will face torture or mistreatment. And that was clearly the case in his situation, and Germany should not have deported him. And that's the case Human Rights Watch and others, including Leila, have been making to the German authorities for the last days and weeks.
Okay, thank you. Leila, I'd like to get your thoughts on the Ergashev case, and also mentioned that he even tried to commit suicide before he got on the plane, right?
Yes. The situation with Ergashev was sort of emblematic of the treatment that the Central Asian asylum seekers faced here in Europe during the procedures, and this complete distrust of their story and how the authorities, the migration authorities, the asylum officer, the judges, how they, just say you're not enough of an activist, basically, like you're not famous enough or something else. I don't know. It seems like the authorities in Germany and other European countries, unfortunately, have some sort of a picture that the Central Asian asylum seekers obviously don't fit. Or maybe they don't have any picture. I'm not even sure, because it's unclear whether or not they have any sort of like conditions that an activist has to meet in order to satisfy the requirements of an asylum procedure. The problem also was that his procedure, basically, it lasted so long. He's been in Germany for 13 years. And obviously, it's not Ergashev's fault that the Germany took so long to review his case. I mean, when someone looks at a situation of someone who is like Ergashev, fled from autocracy, and really does very light Googling and reads about Tajikistan, it's quite clear, as Hugh has said, it's quite clear that whatever the circumstances of a person are, and since the person has had connection, any sort of connection to the opposition groups, that returning him to the country is fraught with really bad consequences for that individual. It's quite understandable. The problem also for the other asylum seekers, and we've seen it across some other cases in Germany as well. We had, I'll give you an example. We have a case of a woman who is a wife of a very prominent critic of Rahman regime. And she was subjected, I will not name her here for the sake of her privacy and safety, but she was subjected to severe forms of sexual or physical violence at the hand of the officers at the Tajik KGB, the KNB, and she fled when they released her after this session of torture that lasted, I believe, 24 hours. They held her. they released her, and they said that she will have to come back to them and see them regularly on a weekly basis. Otherwise, if she fails to do that, they will subject to the same um, torture. They will subject her daughter. And she obviously fled together with her children. And her procedure also lasted almost 8 years, if I'm not mistaken. And she has been receiving denials at every instance. And I don't even know how to call this, but the asylum authority has arrived at a conclusion that although she was subjected to rape, that it happened so many years ago that it's no longer traumatic. And the same thing was repeated by the judge, unfortunately. So I don't even know how to describe a logic like that. I don't know if these people haven't, can tell us how long they think lasts the trauma over rape for a woman. Whether or not there is an expiration date on it, it's really unclear. We have a similar situation of a woman from Tajikistan in Belgium. She is not an opposition member or is not connected to opposition, but she is connected to a group of religious believers. The entire family that's being persecuted for years now by the Tajik regime. At least 14 members of that family that we know of are imprisoned, some for life. And she was denied asylum. She has 4 children, two other children of her sister, who was unlawfully deported from Poland last year. And she's now facing deportation. We won the case together with the Belgian lawyers. We won the case against the extradition. But now, as always, the authorities are trying to use this very tricky method of getting rid of asylum seekers using the deportation procedure, which has, lower threshold than the extradition. It's very easy to carry out. So basically that's the info I have so far to share, but I'll probably come up with more to share with you.
Bruce, just to come in, just to answer your question about Ergashev, if you like, regarding the awful situation that he found himself in and the fact that he injured himself. Yeah, while he was in detention after his deportation had been decided upon. Yeah, he must have been in a very desperate situation, and he injured himself quite badly. I think he cut himself on his arms and maybe in his stomach as well, quite deeply. A friend of his reported to us that this was a suicide attempt. Obviously, we do not know. We have not been able to talk to him, but that shows the severity and the fear with which he faced the prospect of returning to Tajikistan. He was treated in hospital in Germany, but then was returned to the detention center with a report saying he was fit enough to travel. Obviously, we can't assess that, but we know he was extremely weak when he, according to a witness account of when he arrived in Dushanbe, we know he was extremely weak and frail when he got off the plane. So we know he was in a very poor condition.
Something else I wanted to add, sorry. In the medical report, there was the doctor's recommendation to take out the stitches in 10 days. And when we were speaking with his lawyer, I pointed it out to her. I said, well, there will be nobody taking out his stitches in 10 days because he will be sitting in a basement in KGB in Dushanbe. And she says, yes, I know. So, we really don't know if his wounds will be treated properly. Probably not, because that's not provided in the KGB basement normally. So he's going to suffer from his wounds in detention now.
Okay, let's mention some of the other people who are being affected by this. But, I said at the start of this program that I wanted to talk a little bit about Koshkarbai, Tori Morata, but feel free to mention any cases that have happened recently so we can highlight their plight and get their names out there. Leila, you want to start?
Yes, so in Poland we have Koshkarbai Tori Morata. He is in the asylum procedure. We don't know how that will play out, but based on our experience with other Central Asian asylum seekers in Poland, the procedure is quite difficult, and it's very rare that Poland issues a positive decision on any asylum application. He hasn't received any decision yet, but at least he's not in detention. Most of the Tajik dissidents somehow end up being in detention in a closed camp where they have no way to communicate with their lawyers or with us or with anybody. They have no possibility to have a phone. We also have in Poland now the time in Libayev, who is also awaiting a decision. He is a Karakalpak blogger and journalist who is publishing his materials on YouTube channel. We also have Karlabay Bekmuratov, also an activist, and his procedure is now, I think, at least 4 or 5 years old, I believe. Actually, he arrived in Poland just before COVID began. And then his case either got lost or something else, so he's hanging in limbo in Poland. He restarted his procedure again this year, so we don't know also how that will play out. Hopefully, better than with the other asylum seekers. And there are new arrivals this year of Karakalpaks. 2 or 3 more people arrived. Yeah. So the Karakalpak dissident community in Europe is growing.
Indeed. In terms of other sort of context and other people to mention, I think I would mention the other 2 Tajik activists who were deported from Germany. So these are people who are no longer in Germany, but back in prison in Tajikistan, because it helps us and listeners understand the pattern of what's been going on here. Just last year in 2023, Abdullahi Shamsiddin, who was a Tajik activist who'd been in Germany for many years, since 2009, I think, was deported back to Tajikistan. He was given a sham trial back in March, I believe, last year, and was given, I believe, 7 years in prison. So he's now in prison and languishing in prison. His family reports he's been mistreated at various stages of his detention and imprisonment. He suffered the same sort of problems immediately before he was deported as well. Of the courts not really believing he was opposition enough, as Leila said, and not recognizing the fact that that he was closely associated with the opposition. In his case, a close relative is a very senior person in the IRPT, the Islamic Resistance Party, Renaissance Party of Tajikistan. So there's even clearer evidence connecting him to the opposition of Tajikistan than there is in the Ergashev case. Nevertheless, he was deported back and immediately put into prison, which contradicts completely the perspective of the German migration authorities and the courts, that they will not be in danger when they are returned to Tajikistan. It's complete contradiction. Nevertheless, in both these cases, these people have been, deported, and immediately at the airport they are detained. The other person to mention is Bilal Korbonaliev, who was another Tajik activist who was deported back to Tajikistan in December last year, so just under a year ago, and he's been given a 10-year sentence. So 3 people within 18 months in Germany, and this is extremely worrying because Germany, is a country which claims to uphold high domestic and international human rights standards. And this is a terrible pattern that has developed in the last 2 years.
Yeah, but I wanted to add to Hugh's description of Abdullahi Shamsuddin's situation. In his case, also, the German authorities have been fumbling with his case for also about 10 years, I believe, if not more. And it's just so unbelievable that at the end, at the last trial, the judge was like, I don't believe that you are the son of Shamsuddin Saidov, I think is his name, of this one of the leaders of IRPC, who is also living in Germany. And so the logical question is, if you don't believe that he is the son of Shamsuddin Saidov, and his father is right there, you can probably order a genetic test, right? Like to establish whether or not they have
Exactly.
familial relationship. And that's what the activists in Germany did. They basically ordered a private paternity test, which showed obviously that that's his son and that's his father. And the court didn't accept this result, basically saying that it was not procedurally done in accordance with whatever requirements of the court. But the court could have done it itself, right, and handled it in its own way, in the way that it should have been handled, to make sure that it's secure, that nobody, replaced the samples and so on. But the court didn't want to do it. So, the entire situation really shows that it was not the court did not really have a goal of establishing the truth. And that's, in my mind as a lawyer, that's the actual very reason and very foundations of existence of judiciary. Because otherwise, if the court is not interested in establishing the truth, the question is, why do we even have the courts, right? That's what we have the courts for. But in cases of asylum seekers, in our discussion, that's the Central Asian asylum seekers, we unfortunately don't see the European judiciary showing interest in establishing the truth and the circumstances that these people are telling the court about are not convincing to the court, and they're just not interested at all. And the only purpose for the courts and for the asylum authorities is to get rid of as many asylum seekers as they can, probably following this political narrative of getting rid of foreigners and migrants and asylum seekers, unfortunately.
Okay, thank you. And a reminder, we're talking about the fate of Central Asians seeking asylum in European countries. And my guests are Hugh Williamson, the Europe and Central Asia Director of Human Rights Watch, and Leila Seiitbek, a lawyer and chairwoman of NGO Freedom for Eurasia. Thank you both again. And okay, so let's talk a little bit about the European, what happens in Europe. How do they hand them over? We've already been discussing this. We're into it, but surely very cursory checks of the internet. These officials in any European country can go to either one of your websites, for example, Human Rights Watch or Freedom for Eurasia, and find information about these people. How do they keep slipping through the cracks? What's going on with these European countries that they're deporting these people when there's plenty of evidence out there to show what's going to happen when they get sent back?
That's a really big question, and the right question to be asking, Bruce. There's a couple of answers I would say to that. One is the sort of context, and Leila just sort of touched on it in the end of her most recent answer, that the very hostile environment regarding migration, asylum, and refugees in Europe at the moment. Remember way back to the so-called refugee crisis in 2015-16, when millions of people came from Syria. That was a time when Europe, to some extent, opened its doors and opened its arms to a lot of refugees coming from war zones. Obviously, it's welcomed, and taken in several million from Ukraine as well. So the continent has been, rightly receptive of people, many people from war zones and other countries around the world as well. But perhaps, partly linked to that, there's also a greater political hostility towards growing numbers, or what are perceived as growing numbers of people coming from other parts of the world to try to live in Europe, people who are perceived as economic migrants and so on. There's been a strengthening of far-right parties, as we know, in Europe, in France, in the Netherlands, in Italy, in Germany, in other countries, in Hungary, of course. And they've picked up migration and asylum as being a useful issue for them to garner votes and to create a toxic atmosphere on this issue. So that's the context in which officials are making decisions, and courts are making decisions as well. So things like deportations, harsh rulings on migration are seen as what's expected of the authorities these days. And it's much more difficult for groups opposing these issues and standing up for migrants' rights to do so. Their funding is being cut. There's less political traction with MPs and so on, broadly speaking, not only in Germany, but in other countries as well. And in the European Union as a whole, there's a backlash against these issues around being more tolerant towards migration and asylum issues. So that's the sort of context, I would say, Bruce, is the part of the explanation for why there's this trend. The other part is, I think, governments really do not understand the nature of what has become called transnational repression, which is what Tajikistan is doing in these cases. It's looking outside its borders. It's trying to identify who are the people involved in the opposition, not only inside Tajikistan, but also outside the country, and identifying them and wanting them to be silenced, usually by getting them back to Tajikistan and putting them in prison. And that's exactly what's been happening in the last few years. So Tajikistan exerts this sort of transnational repression in Germany and elsewhere. But governments like Germany, Poland, are not geared up to understanding what they're doing. They believe they're dealing with a normal asylum case, even though they, of course, could just go on the internet and see how badly repressive Tajikistan is. Maybe the courts have some idea of that, but they don't put these pieces together in a way that is necessary to understand exactly what Tajikistan's strategy is in this. And that's what needs to happen. Perhaps we can talk a bit about what changes would be necessary. But I think those two things, the toxic environment regarding migration and the lack of understanding of what Tajikistan's strategy is of identifying opposition figures overseas and trying to silence them, are the two key elements which explain why these things are happening in greater numbers.
Yeah, Leila, I'd like to get your thoughts on that. And let me throw in too that, in terms of transnational repression, it's already been pointed out many times that the Tajik government is one of the leaders in dealing with Interpol and they have like a disproportionate amount of people on the Interpol list that the Tajik government wants. A country of 10 million people, with more people on the Interpol list than countries that have 10, 20 times that kind of population. So what every time I see an Interpol statement when they talk about transnational repression, some official from Interpol says, we understand the problem and we're working on it. I've been hearing this for like 10 years now. That we see that it's being abused. The red notice is being abused, and we're taking measures to reform that and tighten it up. And yet, here we are. It's still a problem.
Yeah, it is known to a certain group, a community of people who regularly read news about the human rights issues in Tajikistan, or read like you who do their daily monitoring and daily news review that is connected to the region and so on. But it's quite clear that to the officials, especially officials in the asylum agencies in Europe, these things are unknown. And it's quite surprising, actually, that they really have a very poor understanding of what the Freedom House reports are, for example. Like they would be surprised if you bring something to them and actually, highlight some portions of it to them. And, one thing, it's one thing if some of these authorities and officials and judges are ready to actually even read what you're presenting to them, because some of them don't even want to read. And yes, so Tajikistan was also named one of the worst perpetrators of transnational repression. And in Ergashev's case, for example, and Hugh can also confirm that the judge in Ergashev's case has actually responded to this argument that he will be subjected to repressions and that he was subjected to transnational repressions. He said something like, "It is not believable that Tajikistan would waste its time and resources on going after someone like Ergashev." So there you clearly see that the judge absolutely doesn't understand what Tajikistan is, and the Tajik regime will not, they're just not lazy. Like you said, Bruce, they have 4,500 people on their list published on the website of National Bank of Tajikistan. And everybody's there. Kabiri is there. All the other members of IRPC that we search in that list are there. The journalists are there. It's just a bunch of activists are there, small and big and various, actually. And there is just, I think, genuine lack of understanding and genuine lack of interest. I also want to point out that I myself was an asylum seeker. I applied for asylum in Austria in 2016, and it was actually in the midst of those asylum crisis or refugee crisis, along with the other refugees, that were running from Syrian war and from Afghanistan. And when I was telling my story to the asylum officer, I was telling him about how, about a Kyrgyz Gafenbe, about the KGB in Kyrgyzstan, what they've been doing, and about my personal experience with them. And you know what he was doing? He was smirking. He didn't believe a word I told him during that interview. The problem also was that the procedure, I eventually got a denial from the asylum authority, and I had to appeal it in the court. And I won the appeal. But it took, let's see, it took me 6 years to do that. 6 years. And I am a trained lawyer, right? And I had resources and I had support from college. And it took me 6 years. It was not an easy battle, I must tell you. And most of the asylum seekers, they don't speak English. They aren't, they don't have the legal training that I have. They have way less connections that could support them in that situation. And the asylum procedure is a difficult procedure. It's very confusing. It's complicated. It's very expensive also. So I don't understand why the European authorities find it acceptable to extend these procedures for a decade or for 6 years, 8 years, or more even. Deny the asylum applications for the people who clearly deserve them. Clearly should not be sent back. Because that's what the law says. They force these people to go into the appeal procedures. And that is very expensive because an asylum seeker himself, obviously, is not capable of drafting an asylum appeal. He needs, or she needs a lawyer, and most of them don't have the money to hire a lawyer. So they miss the dates. They aren't able to lodge an appeal properly. Or those that hire these lawyers, they, they keep fighting, and then it just becomes really, really expensive and very crazy. And it's not just expensive for the asylum seeker, it's also very expensive for the state. Because you have now, various courts dealing with this issue that's dragging on for years. And then the asylum seeker has to then lodge an application to the European Court for Human Rights, and that costs money also. And there are even less lawyers that can do that, even less than the asylum lawyers. The problem with applying for interim measures to the ECPHR, very high threshold. The lawyer has to have the qualifications to do that. And it's just really difficult to find such lawyers also. The interim measures with the Committee Against Torture in the UN, also possible to use for the asylum seeker. The asylum seeker himself won't be able to do it. Again, it has to be an expert, or it has to be a lawyer to do that. And they also demand all of the documents to be submitted in English. And most of the procedures in Europe are not in English. They're like in Polish, they're in German, they're in Spanish, they're in all kinds of different languages. Hungarian, Slovakian. How to translate all of that? It's hundreds of pages of procedural documents. So most of these procedures are not accessible to the asylum seekers. I can't imagine how the states are expecting these poor people to win in the uphill battle. It's impossible.
Indeed. In a sense, to try to sort of identify and what governments could do better to try to stop themselves, in a sense, being enablers of transnational repression. That's what Germany's been in this case of Ergashev. It's been an enabler for Tajikistan, because its courts have turned a blind eye to the clear evidence that he was, should not have been returned to Tajikistan, but they returned him anyway. And some groups, Human Rights Watch, Leila's organization, other groups have been, trying to raise the profile of this issue of transnational repression with governments in Europe, in the States, and so on for some time now. Human Rights Watch did a report about this in February this year, in which we pulled together examples of transnational repression by governments ranging from China to Iran to governments in Africa, Rwanda, and Central Asia. And Tajikistan is by far the most prominent and concerning example within Central Asia, although Uzbekistan and Kazakhstan also, and Turkmenistan, of course, are mentioned. And we made, the report also makes recommendations about what could be done. And there's essentially that boils down to awareness raising with governments about the nature of transnational repression, the strategies governments use to kidnap people, to use Interpol red notices, as you've mentioned, Bruce, and what can be done about it. And that means, much, much better training, awareness raising of prosecutors, of court officials, of government interior ministries, awareness raising. And then there's steps they can take to protect the communities who are most vulnerable to these actions, such as setting up hotlines, setting up procedures where people can register when they've been a victim of transnational repression, if they've been surveilled, for instance, by their government. Tajikistan does that in Germany as well. Surveillance examples where there's much more accessible methods of protection by, police as well, becoming more aware also at the local level that people from these countries are vulnerable to this sort of repression essentially by spies from Tajikistan or other countries active within their country. So these are all very practical things that governments can do, and these are the sort of things that we're calling on governments to do better. Now, there's been some progress on this. I mean, the European Union's adopted some resolutions. The Council of Europe has taken some action on this. Other NGOs are by far further on than this. The US as well has also been has taken further steps on this. The FBI has adopted a definition of transnational repression, for instance, and taken some other steps. So there's definitely examples out there of better things governments can do. But Germany, absolutely, based on the experience of the last 18 months just regarding Tajikistan, needs to act much more firmly to deal with these sorts of efforts by Tajikistan to get their people back and to stop Germany being an enabler of this sort of abuse.
Thanks. Leila, let's get to you. And I'm curious because, what Hugh was talking about, you would think that they would reach a point where, in 18 months, they've had 3 people they deported just from one country, from Germany, 3 people deported to Tajikistan. And in every case, if you follow it up even a little, you see these people were detained. The 2 of them were sentenced to prison right away, so that when somebody like Ergashev shows up, they can say, okay, he says he's opposition, and let's see if he's in danger of being to be imprisoned and tortured when he goes back to Tajikistan, and just look at the 2 cases of the guys that just got sent back last year and go, okay, we at least have to pay more attention to this and listen to what he has to say. You would think that there would be some simple list. They could just put a mark over there. If it says Tajikistan, give it a little extra scrutiny before you make a decision. There's nothing like this at all.
Unfortunately, no. There is no such thing, and every court and every judge and every asylum officer, they make their own decisions. And it's really, also a human factor plays a big role. It all depends on whether a person cares to go and do some extra research to raise his own awareness or not. And most of the time, people just don't have time for this. In order for the country to be aware of another country being a prohibited destination for deportations, there needs to be a designation, sort of like, the way that Afghanistan was designated by the European Union. There is a ban on deportation to Afghanistan. And there is no ban on deportation to Tajikistan, and I don't know why. There should be. Actually, I do know why, because it requires a lot of work. There has to be case law that collected on various cases against their countries. So there are lawyers that need to do that work. There is advocacy campaign that needs to be done, and that's just a lot of resources that unfortunately we don't have. But after discussing all this today, I'm hoping that maybe Hugh and I and the other colleagues who are working on this field from the other NGOs who also deal with the region and the repression cases in the region, we can get together and maybe brainstorm some form of a campaign, because obviously we do need to designate Tajikistan in some way in Europe, because this needs to stop. For example, according to the recent information that we heard yesterday, there is at least 1,500 Tajiks on the list to be deported. We don't know who these people are, but that's a lot of people. So if they start deporting them en masse, that is it's going to be a catastrophe. It's going to be a catastrophe for the dissident community of Tajiks in Europe. It's really is going to be a really horrible example of enabling the transnational repression of the world's worst autocratic country.
Yeah,
and I don't know why Europe. No, I don't know why Europe doesn't see Rahmon as such, because they see Lukashenko for what he is, and I don't know why Europe doesn't see Rahmon for what he is. They're even trying to sign, some sort of establish some sort of agreements with Tajikistan, cooperation agreements, and some mutual visits between Europe and Tajikistan and so on. And we know that Rahmon is actually much worse than Lukashenko, and the prison conditions and the treatment of prisoners in Tajikistan is much worse than that in Belarus. And you know how I know? Because my one of my colleagues that works with me for Hotel Life, you know him. You both know him. He has provided a really detailed description of how he was detained in Belarus, and I know the Human Rights Watch at the time made a statement. He provided a description, and then compared it to to the conditions, abysmal conditions of Tajik prisons. And I know that Belarusian prisons are also bad, but Tajik prisons, they're just really difficult to survive. Sorry, you wanted to say something?
I was just gonna obviously the point about why Germany does not treat Germany's overall relations with, or Europe's overall relations with Tajikistan is a wider topic. For this focus, of course, the war in Ukraine has created a much more of an incentive for Germany to try to have a close relationship with countries in Central Asia to avoid sanctions busting and those sorts of things. So there's geopolitics mixed in here as well. But your question, Bruce, is absolutely the right one. Why is there not more joined up thinking within a country like Germany? There's been cases, in the last 18 months. Why on earth is there another case now? Leila nailed it and said that each judge, each local authorities, migration service makes their own decisions and they're not sharing information in an effective way. But there's another nuance to this in that the foreign ministry, where the expertise lies on Tajikistan, is fully aware, obviously, of how bad the human rights record is of Tajikistan, and fully aware that opposition activists will be jailed if they're returned to the country. And indeed, the foreign ministry writes reports which are available to the migration service in Germany for them to read about how bad things are. So in theory, the system should work. There is the information available to the migration officials in the courts for them to inform themselves. It evidently does not work, and it's not quite clear where the breakdown is, why the courts do not inform themselves properly based on the German foreign ministry evidence of how bad things are. We talked to the foreign ministry about it. I really do not want to. They are also ultimately responsible for this, and that's what we tell them. We do not let them off the hook, as it were, by just saying they're doing their job and they are not the ones who make the final decisions, because that's true. They are not the ones who to deport people to Tajikistan. It's migration authorities and courts who do that. But they have a responsibility to make sure that their expert reports do reach the right people to make the right decisions about not deporting people back to countries like Tajikistan.
Hey Hugh, do you know where the breakdown is? I think I might have a good guess on this. So the judges, when they use the country reports from their own ministries of foreign affairs, they say, yes, Tajikistan is bad, or Uzbekistan is bad, or whatever, right? Kazakhstan, yes, there is torture. Yes, there is repressions against the activists, but we don't think you're an activist. We don't think that you're going to face this treatment because we just don't consider you, famous enough or activist enough or opposition enough or what happened during the procedure with Shovalizada a few years ago in Austria. You remember that case as well, right?
Yes.
So he ends up on the Interpol, goes through the extradition procedure. The prosecutor, not a stupid guy, obviously, based on what I was reading from his statement, the prosecutor says, we are not going to satisfy this extradition request because it's clear that he is not a terrorist or extremist. He is a political activist. So we're not extraditing him because it's actually prohibited to use Interpol to repress political activists. A very smart prosecutor. And then this statement goes into the court, and the judge says, "Well, yes, I agree with what the prosecutor says, but the Interpol form contains your name, but contains names for your parents that are different from the names that you have provided. Do you know why there is this difference?" And Shovalizada goes, "No, I have no idea what the Tajik authorities wrote in spaces where my parents' names should be. Like, it's out of my control. I can't, I don't know." So the Tajik authorities wrote false names for his parents when they were filling out the form for the Interpol against him. And the judge is using that against Shovalizada and says, well, because there is this deficiency, we think that, the entire repression situation that we discussed about, that's not you. And we don't know who you are, but we think that you are not going to face any torture. And they sent him out. And on the same day, he arrived in Dushanbe. There is a press release of the prosecutor general thanking Austria for cooperation in catching a very dangerous criminal. I mean, that's just a shameful and shameless twisting of, facts that is happening by the judges, by the asylum authorities. And I think it's just, they're doing it in order to not to establish the truth, but in order to arrive at a denial at any cost, even if they have to twist the facts.
Okay, thank you. Unfortunately, we are out of time for this program. We could get. I'm sorry because there's a lot of other things I'd like to cover here, but we have gotten the limit, and I did say I would try to hold to a certain limit. So I thank you very much. I will have you back on the program again very soon because there's a lot of other things, like I said, that I really wanted to cover. But for now, thank you again to Leila and Hugh for being on the show. And a big thank you, as always, to Nathan Shoemaker, our Majlis podcast producer in Washington, D.C., and a reminder, you can subscribe to the Majlis podcast or the Central Asia in Focus newsletter by visiting Radio Free Europe, Radio Liberty's website at rfarl.org. Thanks, and we'll be back again soon. Bye-bye.